Okay. Well, I think what's quite interesting is that I never set out to be a nurse, although I've been a nurse for many, many years. I seem to have quite an early leaning towards helping people and being involved in projects where I, like voluntary projects at school and things like that, where I was helping people. And whilst I was in the sixth form at school, I'd helped at a psychiatric hospital, and I just really, really loved it. I think I chose psychiatry because it had a bit more of an edge to it. I'd wanted to help with prisoners, but my mother had said I couldn't go to the discharged prisoners club. And so somehow I think there just seemed more different people in psychiatry, and that seemed really interesting. So I went and helped there, and at first I thought that I would be a social worker in a psychiatric setting. But I chose to do a nursing course because it seemed a better preparation than going to university and getting a degree in English. But as it happened, the nursing course that I chose was so inspirational that it just it was a really fantastic course, and I just stayed in nursing after that. It was what I wanted to do. I've found working with older people really rewarding. One is because people have such fascinating stories to tell themselves. So people have got a lot of character, and everybody's really, got their own story, and it's really interesting to hear about the lives that people have had. I think as well that maybe something a bit like, there is a bit of a kind of slightly rebellious streak in me, I think, that I've never quite been able to live out in some ways. So I think that, in a way, older adults isn't especially a popular branch of nursing to come into. And I think that's a real shame. And so a bit of me is probably quite likes the challenge of thinking, well, this is a really good field of nursing to be in. People should know a bit more about it, and then they'd realise. I think that people have the wrong perception of it, really. Yes, there's lots of significant things that happen to you in your training that stay with you really all the time and colour how you see things. But one of the things that I really remembered was that I'd started work as a Macmillan nurse, and it was really early days when I started in the community, and I joined a team, a very well-established team. And when I joined there, the team was quite upset because one of the more experienced nurses had had a complaint made about her, and the complaint was that she'd held hands with with a patient as he was dying, and it was the wife of the man that had complained. And the nurse was really upset because I think that most people probably would have thought that was quite a good thing to have done, to have supported somebody while they were dying. I don't know that I ever really shared this with them, but I was trying to understand what was it that had perhaps motivated this lady to complain. And my hypothesis really, because, I don't know whether this was the case, was that I suddenly sort of tried to see it from the wife's perspective, and I thought that maybe what had happened was that this lady's husband was dying. I can't remember how old she was, but possibly a middle-aged lady, looking after her husband at home, trying really hard, probably not looking after herself very well, certainly not having time to really attend to her appearance and her kind of well-being, really. And then in comes a sort of rather young, attractive Macmillan nurse who knows everything, and who, without realising, sort of appears to know everything and how to do it, and she comes in and sort of shows the family that it's quite, not simple, but this is how you do it. And I'm exaggerating because I know it didn't happen quite like that, but I just think it might have seemed like that. And this person, the nurse, comes into the home, and she becomes very special and important for the family. She's going to help them cope through this difficult time. And she comes into the home and she goes right to the heart of their relationship, in that she goes into the bedroom where the husband is, which is normally, perhaps their private space. And then she goes and holds hands with him when he's dying. And when you put it like that, I think that it's much clearer as to why the lady might have made a complaint. I'm not sure she would have ever consciously seen it like that, and certainly I know the nurse wouldn't have meant it to have been like that. But I think that it really made a big impact on me, this whole point of not taking over and not being too helpful and not being, the whole role of the nurse is to enable the family to care for their person. And actually that could have happened. So the nurse could have helped his wife, the patient's wife, comfort him, and then she would have had a memory of herself holding his hand rather than a nurse. When I started my nursing, this is back in the late 1970s, the style of the day was that at around 4 o'clock you turned the beds back. So on a general ward you would have gone to all the patients' beds, plumped the pillows and turned the patient's bed back, ready for them to get into it later in the evening. And I can remember going, and the patient wasn't at his bedside, he'd probably gone to the toilet or something, and I plumped this man's pillow, and as I lifted his pillow, I saw this thing under the pillow, and it was pink and fleshy. And I thought, I don't know really why I thought this, but it was a bit kind of messy as well. And I thought, oh my goodness, he's chopped his thumb off and he's put it under the pillow. Now, that seems a really odd thing to have thought, really. And I thought I better tell the staff nurse or the sister, because I was just a student. So I thought I must go and tell them that this man's amputated his thumb for some reason. But I thought, well, I better just check before I'll have another look at it, just to be sure, because I don't want to tell them the wrong thing. So I had another look at it, and then the patient arrived back, and he got quite agitated and said, what was I doing, leave it alone. And it turned out that it was a sausage that he'd taken off the dinner trolley, and he was keeping it under his pillow in case he got hungry later on in the night. And so that was so I was really glad that I hadn't told anybody. Well, I think the other one, which is very quick, is I also thought that working in the East End, a lot of Jewish patients and you don't know, I was very young, and I kind of thought I need to understand more about people. So I decided to read about Jewish religion, and I think it's a really good example of how thinking you can understand people by reading a book. But I read about Jewish religion thinking this would, feel quite proud of myself, really. This would give me insight into other people's culture. And I read this really interesting account of how some Jewish people, when they died, if they had a limb amputated, it would be kept in a special fridge so that when they were buried, they could be buried whole, I think, for a kind of afterlife. I thought that's really, really interesting. So the first time I met a Jewish man with one leg on the ward, I decided, with my knowledge, to say to him, "Oh, have they kept your leg in a special fridge?" And he just didn't know what I was talking about. And it was one of those really awkward things that he said, "What did I mean?" And I said, "Well, a special fridge." And it was really good learning point, though, because I think that, not connecting with the person, it may be that some particular branch of Judaism, that's true, but I didn't check it out with him at all. I was showing off a bit, I think, really. And he'd had his leg amputated years ago, and he certainly had no idea. And then I had to say to him as well, because it's when you die, I was like, oh goodness, this wasn't what we planned to talk about at all. I've always been to the seaside for a kind of family holiday with my parents, and then later on when my mum died, I went with my dad every year, and then recently tried to take my dad to the seaside every year as a kind of holiday, even if, whatever else we've done. And that's been difficult over the last few years because of his health. So we've decided that we were able to get a place in Margate. And it's been really exciting. But what's really lovely is just the beach, just the walk. You can walk for miles along the front, and there's lots of lovely bays and just the whole scenery. And Turner painted there because of the light in Margate. It's just fantastic, really. At the moment, I end up listening to football anthems, all of which are a little bit dated because I found an old CD of football anthems, and my son loves them, and so we do listen to a lot of football anthems in Margate.
Fabulous.
Yes. Again, a favourite film. I think that does change as well with time. I've always liked the kind of David Lean type films, kind of slightly odd, thriller-y kind of things. I particularly enjoyed a film called Breaking the Waves, but I think probably one of the favourite films is An Angel at My Table. And I really like the actress in it. I think that she's called Kerry Fox. But this is an Australian film about a poet who had mental illness. And I keep looking at the books because I bought all the books to read. I haven't read the books yet. Yes, I mean, I think that when I was younger and I was at Sunday school, we had to, I say had to because I think we probably did have to, collect for the Junior Missionary Association, the JMA, and we had a little church collecting box, and every year we would get a little medal or something like that to show that we'd collected money, and we would do a play. And one of the people that I sort of seem to remember is, I don't know if she would have come, or some relative of Gladys Aylward, who saved all these children and brought them over the mountains in China. And I think people like that, people who've done these things, who really seem to have done things, who knows what personal motivation people had really, but seemingly, have helped an enormous amount of people for little personal reward. Being a research nurse is really interesting because you really have to resist trying to help anybody, in that sense that you don't have a clinical role with the person that you're seeing. So your remit is to talk about the research, to carry out the research protocol, to make your assessments, to engage with the person, and to facilitate the questionnaires and measures being done, and implement the protocol for the research. And it's very interesting, really, because you have to resist commenting on things that you might know the answer to. So in this case, I'm working with people who have a psychotic illness. And they may or may not ask you questions about their condition, but a lot of the time you do have to refrain from giving clinical advice because that's for their team to do.
And can you tell us a bit about the research that you're currently involved in?
Yes, it's a randomised randomised study looking at treatment for what they call very late onset schizophrenia-like psychosis. So this is a psychotic illness that people experience. The onset is after the age of 60, and the symptoms are those of psychosis, and they're like those that you would get with schizophrenia. So particularly florid symptoms like auditory hallucinations, hallucinations of any type really, delusions, distress, and typically the person's really quite troubled by them. That often, the delusions are often of feeling that people are out to hurt them, interfere with them, persecute them. So people like the neighbours causing, taking over their life, interfering with them, putting gas through into the house, sending noises or smells, or interfering with them physically to cause their life distress or to harm them. I think that I would struggle to answer the question generally, but I'd probably, the word connectedness seems to kind of come to me. And I suppose that thing about how you stay connected to people, and that whole thing about really being able to change over time. And I know people use the expression about being true to yourself, but it seems to me that one of the harder things is to accept that you have to change and that all the people around you change as well. And that in that state of constant changing, you've got to reconfigure your relationships with those people around you, and yet everything's different. And that sort of contradiction where everything's the same and yet everything's different. And you see people that you haven't seen for years, and they've done hundreds of things, but it feels like they haven't, or, somehow or other you think you can just kind of sum up, oh, what have you been doing for the last 20 years? In a kind of short, you're never going to tell them that. But it's as though you attempt to have that conversation. So I think it's something to do with managing change and trying to stay connected to, perhaps it's connected to who you are and other people, really. Something like that.